Ryan Carter had spent his entire life building something real, something that couldn't be dictated by board meetings or neighborhood bylaws. His farm, a rugged stretch of land just outside the pristine suburb of Willow Creek, was his pride and joy. The land had been in his family for 3 generations, long before the first identical beige house popped up across the road. Out here, he answered to no one but the seasons. When to plant, when to harvest, when to let the animals roam, his life moved at nature's pace, not at the whims of some homeowners association. That peace shattered the moment Marge Davenport, self-appointed queen of the HOA, strutted up his gravel driveway like she had just conquered it. She was dressed in one of those stiff, beige pantsuits that made her look like a walking real estate brochure, clipboard clutched tight in her manicured fingers. Ryan had seen her type before, people who mistook control for power, the kind who thought rules were meant to be enforced, not questioned. She didn't belong here. Marge surveyed his property with a look of barely disguised disgust, her eyes flicking from his red barn to the roaming chickens to the tractor parked beneath an old oak tree. Ryan leaned against his truck, arms crossed, waiting. He already knew where this was going. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice carrying that forced politeness that barely masked condescension. "I've received multiple complaints from concerned residents regarding the unsightly nature of your property. It's bringing down community standards." Ryan raised an eyebrow, amused. "You do realize this isn't part of the HOA, right?" Marge's smile didn't waver, but her eye twitched just slightly. "Yes, well, your farm is adjacent to our neighborhood, which means it still affects property values. We have certain expectations here, and I believe it would be in everyone's best interest if you made a few adjustments." Ryan followed her gaze as she gestured vaguely at his land, at the things that made it a farm. He had half a mind to ask her which part of his livelihood she found the most offensive, but he already knew the answer. "All of it." He let out a slow chuckle, pushing off his truck. "Let me stop you right there, Marge. My land, my rules. If you don't like the view, I suggest closing your blinds." Her nostrils flared, but she quickly regained her composure. "I was hoping we could resolve this amicably," she said, tightening her grip on the clipboard, "but if you refuse to cooperate, I will take the necessary steps to ensure our community remains up to standard." Ryan didn't bother hiding his smirk as he tipped his hat. "Good luck with that." As Marge turned on her heel and stomped away, already furiously typing on her phone, Ryan had the distinct feeling that this wasn't the last time she'd darken his doorstep. And he was right. The next morning, Ryan woke to the sound of his rooster crowing, the same as it did every morning, marking the start of another day on the farm. He stretched, pulled on his boots, and stepped onto his porch, coffee in hand. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with the soft hues of dawn. Everything felt just as it should, until he spotted something unusual near his fence. A row of freshly planted signs, all bearing the unmistakable HOA logo, lined his property's edge like tombstones. His stomach twisted with irritation, but his curiosity got the better of him. He strolled over, took a closer look, and let out a dry chuckle. Violation notice, unsafe conditions. Excessive noise. Unregulated agricultural activity. The absurd list went on, citing non-existent HOA regulations about unauthorized livestock, non-standard building aesthetics, and unapproved fencing materials. Ryan shook his head, tearing one of the signs out of the ground. It wasn't just nonsense, it was intimidation, and it had Marge Davenport's name all over it. He wasn't stupid. He knew these signs held no legal weight, but they were meant to create the illusion that they did. Meant to send a message. Ryan tossed the sign into the back of his truck, making a mental note to deal with the rest later, and headed toward the barn to start his morning chores. But as he approached, something felt off. The usual morning clucks and rustles of his chickens were missing. His steps quickened, dread creeping up his spine. The coop door was wide open. Ryan swore under his breath, his pulse spiking. He scanned the property, searching for movement, but the hens were nowhere to be seen. His fence, usually sturdy and well-maintained, had been deliberately cut open, the wire slashed in jagged, uneven edges. A rustling noise caught his attention, and he turned toward the mailbox. There, sticking out like a thorn, was a folded piece of paper. He snatched it up and unfolded it with rough fingers. This is what happens when you refuse to follow the rules. Ryan's grip tightened around the note. His gut burned with anger, but his mind stayed cold, calculating. This wasn't just harassment. This was sabotage. He stalked back toward the house, jaw clenched. He needed answers, and fast. Pulling out his phone, he dialed Frank Mitchell, his nearest neighbor, a retired Marine who knew how to handle a fight when one came knocking. 15 minutes later, Frank pulled up in his pickup, stepping out with a thermos in one hand and a wary look on his face. "Heard you had some excitement this morning." Ryan didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You still got that security camera facing the road?" Frank took a sip of coffee. "Sure do. You thinking what I'm thinking?" Ryan nodded, his lips pressed into a tight line. "Somebody let my chickens loose last night. Cut my fence. Left a little message, too." He held up the note. Frank's face darkened as he took the paper, reading the message. "Damn. That's a threat if I've ever seen one." He shook his head. "Come inside, let's check the footage." They went to Frank's den, where a monitor displayed a grainy but clear view of the road leading up to Ryan's property. Frank rewound the footage, and there they were, two shadowy figures creeping along Ryan's fence line in the dead of night, cutting the wire and shooing his chickens into the woods. And leading them? Marge Davenport herself. Ryan exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing at his sides. He had suspected she'd take things too far, but this? This was outright vandalism. Trespassing. A crime. Frank leaned back in his chair, whistling low. "She's bold, I'll give her that." Ryan's smirk was anything but amused. "She's stupid is what she is. And she just gave me everything I need." Frank raised an eyebrow. "You planning to go to the sheriff?" Ryan considered it for a long moment, then shook his head. "Not yet. Cops'll slap her with a warning, maybe a fine. But that's not enough." He turned toward the screen, replaying the footage. "I want her to sweat. I want her to feel the same kind of pressure she's been trying to put on me." Frank grinned, nodding. "Now that's the spirit." Ryan stood, already thinking 10 steps ahead. Marge wanted a war? Fine. She was about to find out that farmers don't back down. That night, while Marge was probably sipping wine in her perfectly manicured living room, Ryan was planning his next move. The intimidation tactics, the phony violation notices, the blatant trespassing, she had made a mistake. A big one. And she was about to regret it. Ryan spent the next morning making calls. He wasn't the kind of man to go running to the authorities over nonsense, but Marge had crossed a line. She had trespassed, destroyed property, and, worst of all, messed with his animals. The sheriff might have given her a slap on the wrist, but Ryan had no intention of letting her off that easy. He had something better in mind. First, he made a call to Jason Reynolds, a younger homeowner in the neighborhood who had been keeping an ear to the ground. Jason wasn't one for HOA politics, but when Marge had come knocking with a petition, he'd grown suspicious. Ryan had a feeling Jason knew more than he'd let on. Sure enough, when Jason showed up at the farm later that afternoon, he had news. "She's been pushing this thing hard," Jason said, shaking his head. "Told everyone it was about improving neighborhood aesthetics, but I actually read the fine print. She's trying to annex your land into the HOA. If she gets enough signatures, she can take it to the city council." Ryan exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He had suspected she was after more than just his barn or his rooster, but now he had proof. She wasn't just trying to harass him, she was trying to steal his land. Jason looked uneasy. A lot of people signed without realizing what it really was. She's banking on the fact that nobody reads the details. Ryan clenched his fists, but instead of rage, something colder settled over him, a plan. That night, he picked up the phone and called an old friend, an artist with a flair for the ridiculous. By sunrise, they were at the barn with buckets of paint and a vision that would make Marge's blood pressure spike. By the end of the day, Ryan's once simple red barn had been transformed into a masterpiece of defiance. On one side, a giant, cartoonish rooster loomed over the landscape, a golden crown perched on its head, looking downright regal. On the other, an oversized HOA violation notice was painted in bold, exaggerated detail, complete with ridiculous legal jargon mocking the absurdity of their demands. But Ryan wasn't done yet. He installed security cameras along the property line, every single one angled to capture any HOA spies or trespassers. And as the final touch, he erected a sign at the fence line, big and bold, impossible to miss. Private property, not HOA territory. Trespassers will be filmed, mocked, and escorted off by chickens. The message was loud and clear. He barely had time to step back and admire his work before his motion detector went off. Like clockwork, Marge was back. She came storming down his driveway, flanked by her two most loyal enforcers, Barb Simmons and Diane Calloway. Clipboard in hand, her face was twisted in fury as she pointed wildly at the barn. "This is harassment," she shrieked. "You are openly mocking the HOA." Ryan, leaning lazily against his truck, chewed a piece of straw and grinned. "Oh, absolutely." Her hands shook as she gestured to the cameras, the mural, the sign. "This is childish, unprofessional, completely unacceptable." Ryan's grin widened. "I thought you'd appreciate the community beautification. Isn't that what the HOA's all about?" Barb gasped, clutching her pearls like she'd just witnessed a crime. Diane looked ready to explode. But it was Marge who lost it first. "You think this is funny?" she snapped, voice rising an octave. "You are devaluing property values with this circus act. I will not allow it." Ryan shrugged. "That's nice, but I don't live in your community." Marge's nostrils flared. "Technically, you're on the border, which means your property still has an impact on HOA members." Ryan folded his arms. "Then maybe they shouldn't have bought homes next to a farm." Marge's jaw clenched so tight he thought she might crack a tooth. Then, in a tone laced with venom, she delivered her final warning. "I have already filed a formal complaint with the zoning board. I will see to it that your land is annexed under the HOA's jurisdiction. Once that happens, you will be forced to comply." Ryan's easygoing demeanor slipped for the first time. He had expected Marge to keep pushing, but actually trying to take control of his land? He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "All right, Marge. You want to play games? Let's play." She smirked, mistaking his amusement for surrender. She turned on her heel, walking away like a woman who thought she'd won. Ryan, however, had no intention of going down without a fight. Marge wasn't the type to accept defiance. Ryan knew that much. But what he didn't expect was just how far she was willing to go. The next morning, he found something waiting for him in his mailbox, a crisp white envelope, the HOA logo stamped in the corner like an official government notice. Inside was an invoice, bold and threatening. Outstanding HOA fees due, $3,500. Failure to remit payment will result in legal action. Ryan let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. He wasn't even in the damn HOA. They had no right to demand a single cent from him. This was nothing more than a scare tactic, another one of Marge's desperate attempts to break him. But she wasn't done. That afternoon, Jason Reynolds knocked on Ryan's door, looking uneasy. He stepped inside, lowering his voice. "It's worse than we thought. She's been making phone calls. Not just to the zoning board, she's got a real estate developer interested in your land." Ryan's stomach tightened. "She's trying to sell something that ain't hers?" Jason nodded grimly. "If she can convince the city council to fold your property into the HOA, she can slap you with every fine in the book, force you to comply, and when you can't keep up with the costs," he hesitated. "They'll try to force a sale. She's already putting out feelers, seeing who's interested." Ryan's grip on the invoice crumpled the paper in his fist. This wasn't about petty rules or personal grudges anymore. Marge was actively trying to take his land. And then, as if the universe wanted to hammer the point home, Frank Mitchell called. "You're gonna wanna see this," Frank said when Ryan picked up. An hour later, Ryan was sitting in Frank's den, watching grainy security footage from across the street. The camera feed focused on Marge's backyard. Jason had been right, she was making plenty of calls. But what caught Ryan's attention wasn't the phone pressed to her ear. It was the massive in-ground pool behind her house. A pool that wasn't there a month ago. Ryan leaned in, his smirk widening. "She's got a pool?" Frank grinned. "Oh, she sure does. And funny thing, HOA guidelines strictly forbid unapproved water features." Ryan whistled low. "So, the woman trying to fine me for a red barn and a rooster just went and broke her own damn rules?" Frank laughed. Hypocrisy at its finest. And that was the moment Ryan knew how he was going to turn the tables. The next day, Ryan made sure that every single person in the neighborhood received an anonymous flyer, complete with high-resolution images of Marge's illegal pool, a bold heading reading "HOA President violates her own rules," and a bullet point list of every fine she should be paying if she actually followed the rules she enforced. The community backlash was instant. Neighbors who had once blindly supported Marge suddenly weren't so sure. Some started demanding an explanation, asking why she was allowed to break the rules while fining everyone else for minor infractions. Even some of her most loyal enforcers, Barb and Diane, started looking uncomfortable. Ryan watched from his porch, sipping his coffee, as Marge came storming down the street, furious beyond words. She didn't even bother knocking when she reached his front steps. "You think this is funny?" she hissed, waving one of the flyers in his face. Ryan leaned against the doorframe, cool and collected. "I think it's educational." Her nostrils flared. "This is slander." "Nah," Ryan said easily, "it's just community awareness." Marge pointed a shaking finger at him. "You have no idea what you've just done." Ryan crossed his arms, unfazed. "Oh, I think I do." She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Fine. You want to play dirty? You want to drag this out? That's fine. Because when I'm done, you'll wish you never crossed me." Ryan simply smiled. "Well, Marge, let's see who breaks first." She turned sharply on her heel and marched back down the driveway, but Ryan wasn't fooled. She wasn't walking away. She was planning her next move. And whatever it was going to be desperate. Ryan had been expecting something big. Marge was unraveling, her grip on the HOA slipping, and he knew she wouldn't go down quietly. But even he was surprised when his phone buzzed at 2:13 a.m. with an alert from his security system. The cameras had picked up movement near the fence line. A shadowy figure, dressed in black with a hood pulled up, crept onto his property, clipboard in hand. Ryan's stomach clenched as he zoomed in on the live feed. It was Marge. She moved with frantic precision, whipping out a measuring tape and scribbling notes as she paced the property. Then, from her pocket, she pulled out a can of spray paint. Before she could even shake it, the floodlights kicked on, bathing the entire property in a blinding white glow. Marge froze like a deer in headlights. Ryan stepped onto the porch, a shotgun slung casually over his shoulder. "Marge," he called, voice laced with amusement, "what exactly do you think you're doing?" She spun, clipboard slipping from her hands. I was just conducting a routine compliance check." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "At 2 in the morning? With a can of spray paint?" Before she could respond, another porch light flicked on. Then another. Across the street, Frank stepped outside, holding up his phone. "Hey Ryan," he called, "just got a notification from my camera. Want me to send you the footage of Marge sneaking around your property?" More neighbors emerged, curious about the commotion. Even old Howie Whitaker shuffled out in his bathrobe, peering over his glasses. "What's going on?" Ryan smirked. "Oh, just some good HOA business." Marge thought she'd do a surprise inspection, at 2 a.m. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gathered crowd. Even her most loyal supporters looked horrified. Barb took a hesitant step forward. "Marge, is this true?" Marge's lips parted, but no words came. Ryan crossed his arms. "I've got enough footage to file a trespassing complaint and a restraining order, but I'll tell you what." He leaned against the railing. "You resign as HOA president, drop this whole takeover nonsense, and I might just let it slide." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Marge's hands clenched into fists. She looked ready to scream, ready to claw her way out of this hole, but with the entire neighborhood watching, she had no choice. She exhaled sharply, humiliated. "Fine." She turned without another word and marched off into the night, defeated. The fallout was swift. The HOA scrambled to distance themselves from Marge. By the end of the week, she had officially resigned. By the end of the month, a for sale sign appeared on her pristine lawn. Rumor had it, she didn't choose to leave, her husband had quietly put the house on the market behind her back. Whether it was shame, whispers behind her back, or sheer humiliation, Marge was gone. And with her departure, property values actually went up. Ryan enjoyed his victory in peace. The obnoxious violation notices stopped. The nosy HOA spies disappeared. His farm remained exactly as it was, rooster and all. But he couldn't resist adding one last touch to his barn mural. Right next to the giant, crowned rooster, his artist friend painted a tiny, furious caricature of Marge, drowning in HOA paperwork, shaking her fist at the sky. At the next neighborhood barbecue, held at Ryan's farm, of course, neighbors laughed, even former HOA loyalists chuckled. Old Howie clapped Ryan on the back, beer in hand. "Damn good work, kid. You put that woman in her place." Frank grinned, raising his drink. "To the man who took on the HOA and won." The crowd cheered. As Ryan leaned back in his chair, watching the sunset over his unrestricted land, he couldn't help but smirk. Marge was gone. The HOA had backed off. And his farm? It had never looked better. Have you ever had to deal with an HOA nightmare or a power-hungry Karen? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.